This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas. It seems like everywhere you look these days, people are questioning like the traditional ways we think about relationships and family.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting. So today we're going to do a deep dive on a topic that really pushes those boundaries. Polygamy in Australia. We've gotten some really fascinating material from you listeners to dig into.
Cool.
First up, we have a law journal article with a pretty provocative title, Polygamy, Proper or Primitive, Possible Pathways to Permitting the Practice in Australia.
Interesting.
And then we're also going to look at a personal essay from Archer magazine called Polygamy in Australia, A Marriage of Many Loves.
Okay, so we've got kind of the legal and historical side and then a personal contemporary perspective.
Exactly. So on this deep dive, we really want to understand the history of all this, the current legal situation in Australia,
Right.
the arguments for and against legalizing it, and get a sense of what polyamorous relationships are actually like for people.
Sounds good.
All right, let's jump.
So right away, looking at these two sources, what's really striking is how they both highlight how marriage itself has always been in flux. The Law Journal article goes way back and traces the very beginnings of marriage as an institution.
Wow.
And it makes this really interesting point that the shift towards monogamy in the Western world kind of sidelined polygamy, but it wasn't always that way.
Right.
It makes you wonder if our current ideas are as fixed as we think they are.
Yeah. This idea that monogamy is this ancient, unwavering foundation of society,
Yeah.
It's challenged right from the start. And the journal also says that polygamy, when it's not tied to religious doctrine, can actually be egalitarian.
Oh, that's interesting.
It really flips the script on how we usually think about it. So if we move past that traditional patriarchal model we often associate with polygamy, does that maybe change how we think about what makes a relationship fair, whether it's two people or more?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems like the structure of a relationship, whether it's two people or more, isn't what automatically makes it fair or just...
Yeah.
It's more about the core principles and, the intentions of everyone involved.
Right.
So bringing this to the present day, both of your sources agree about the legal situation in Australia right now.
Yeah, and it's kind of a contradiction, isn't it? The essay from Archer magazine points out that dating multiple people, even if you're married, isn't illegal here.
Exactly.
You could theoretically have multiple romantic partners.
Exactly, but here's the key distinction.
Okay.
Actually going through with legally marrying more than one person at the same time.
Yeah.
That's bigamy, and that is a crime.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you could face jail time.
Wow. So the essay really highlights how this current legal framework just doesn't really work, does it? It doesn't really acknowledge all these different ways that people are building relationships that go beyond the traditional two-person model.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Our laws are basically designed for couples.
Right.
And that makes it really hard to legally recognize relationships with more people.
Totally. And the author's own experience as part of a throuple, two women and a non-binary person, really brings that point home. So let's talk about the arguments for changing this legal situation.
Right.
What are some of the ways people are proposing to address this?
So the Law Journal article tackles this head on. It suggests that we could legalize polygamy under Australia's main marriage laws, the Marriage Act of 1961 and the Family Law Act of 1975.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is they point to a decision by the New Zealand Supreme Court in a case called Mead v. Paul.
Interesting. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. So basically, the New Zealand court recognized polygamous marriages, those with three or more people, as a collection of individual couples within the larger group.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of seeing it as one big marriage between everyone, the law would acknowledge those individual pairings within the group. You probably have friends in your life who are in different relationships within the same friend group.
Yeah.
Kind of like that.
Oh, that's a good way to think about it.
So the journal suggests that Australia could adopt a similar approach.
That's a really creative way to work with the existing legal system.
Yeah.
It's like saying, hey, we can recognize these relationships without having to rewrite all the rules from scratch.
Right.
So the personal essay makes a different but equally compelling case for legalization, focusing on the human side of things.
Yeah, the author argues that polyamorous relationships are just as valid and that the love and commitment between multiple people deserve the same legal protections as couples.
Yeah.
They point out how unfair it is to deny legal and social benefits to some members of these relationships just because there are more than two people involved.
Absolutely. Like, think about things like inheritance rights or healthcare decisions.
Exactly.
Or even just the basic recognition of their commitment to each other.
It makes you really think about what legal recognition really means.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that point about denying benefits is really powerful. You know, if people are building lives together, sharing responsibilities, sharing affection, why should the law arbitrarily exclude them?
Yeah, I agree.
And the author's own story is such a good example. They found that non-traditional relationships work for them in ways that traditional ones didn't. And it's really moving how they talk about marriage as a way to express that deep commitment as a throuple.
Yeah, it definitely challenges our assumptions about what marriage is supposed to be.
Right. And as the essay points out, polyamory isn't this like fringe thing anymore. It's becoming more visible and accepted all over the world.
That's true.
You know, people are openly identifying as polyamorous and forming these relationships.
Yeah, and the essay makes a really smart point about that argument. We hear a lot about the traditional meaning of marriage being against legalizing polygamy.
Right.
They bring up the fact that marriage has already changed so much.
Yeah, like with same-sex marriage.
Exactly. So this idea of one fixed, unchanging definition of marriage doesn't hold up.
Right. And like we talked about earlier, the Law Journal even showed us that monogamy wasn't always the norm historically.
That's true.
So it makes you think maybe our current legal definitions are more about specific historical circumstances than some universal truth about relationships.
That's a great point. I think that historical perspective is really important. It reminds us that these social institutions aren't set in stone. They change and adapt as society changes.
Definitely.
But it's important to also look at the arguments against legalizing polygamy. And the essay does a really good job of laying those out, too.
Right. It acknowledges those concerns that people have.
Yeah.
Like one of the biggest arguments against it is the potential for harm, especially to women.
Right.
And the increased risk of coercion and abuse of power within these relationships.
Yeah, those are really valid concerns, and we need to think about them carefully.
Absolutely. Another argument is that marriages between two people can be tough enough already.
Yeah.
So adding more people might just lead to more instability and breakups.
It's definitely something to consider.
And then there are all the practical challenges. How would our legal system and society handle things like immigration insurance, parental rights, and responsibilities in a relationship with more than two parents?
Wow. Yeah, that brings up a lot of complex questions.
It does. And we can't forget the slippery slope argument, which, as the essay points out, sounds very familiar to anyone who's been involved in discussions about LGBTQ rights. The worry is that legalizing polygamy might open the door to legalizing other kinds of non-traditional relationships.
Yeah, and some people who fought for marriage equality were against polygamy for exactly this reason.
It shows how complicated it can be within these movements, you know, trying to find that balance between broader inclusion and what's politically realistic.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So the essay also gets into some of the nuances and complexities of this whole debate.
Right. It's not just presented as black and white.
Yeah. So while acknowledging that some polygamous relationships, especially in the past, have caused harm,
Right.
the author reminds us that harm can happen in traditional monogamous marriages too.
Yeah.
You know, things like divorced infidelity and outdated gender roles. It challenges that idealized view of traditional marriage that some people have.
And I think the historical context is really important here. The essay reminds us that for a lot of history, marriage wasn't really about romantic love at all.
Wow.
It was often about economics. You know, women were often treated like property. This really undermines the idea that there's this one pure, unchanging form of traditional marriage that we should just stick to.
That's a really good point.
It helps us see that what we call traditional is actually a product of specific social and economic conditions that existed at the time.
Yeah, that's true. The essay also challenges this assumption that all polygamous relationships are centered around a cisgender heterosexual man.
Right.
And they use their own relationship as an example.
Yeah, a cis woman, a trans woman, and a non-binary person.
Yeah. So it's important to avoid projecting these heteronormative and patriarchal ideas onto all non-monogamous relationships.
Absolutely. The essay also does a good job of explaining the difference between polygyny, one man with multiple wives, and polyandry, one woman with multiple husbands. And it points out that the historical examples we often see were usually in patriarchal societies. So even if we got rid of polygamy, that wouldn't have automatically gotten rid of the patriarchy.
That's a really important distinction.
It shows that we need to focus on tackling the root causes of inequality, not just the structure of relationships.
So the personal experiences shared in the essay really bring all of this together. The author's journey from being in a lesbian couple to forming a throuple with a shared desire for the same level of commitment and legal recognition as couples, even without any clear societal guidelines or legal frameworks, is really insightful.
It's so humanizing, isn't it? It moves beyond all the legal stuff and shows us real people who just want to build their lives together and have their love and commitment recognized by the law.
Right, and there's a comment from another reader of the magazine who's in a similar situation, 3 women in a committed relationship.
Oh, wow.
And it really reinforces the idea that a lot of the common objections to polygamy just don't apply to all polyamorous relationships.
Right.
It shows that there's a lot of diversity within polyamory itself.
Definitely not one size fits all.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, it's clear that the history of marriage is way more complex than we usually think, and that monogamy becoming the dominant model is actually a relatively recent thing in many parts of the world. Legally, Australia prohibits bigamy, but that personal essay really shows how that framework doesn't work for relationships with more than 2 people.
Right.
The arguments for legalizing it range from equality and recognizing diverse forms of love to practical stuff like legal protections and acknowledging the growing visibility of polyamory.
Yeah.
And of course, there are also strong counter-arguments about potential harm, logistical challenges, and worries about undermining past progress on marriage equality.
It's a really nuanced issue with no easy answers.
Yeah. And as the essay says, whether or not polygamy is legalized in Australia, it's a conversation we need to keep having as a society.
Yeah.
The fact that polyamory is becoming more visible and the experiences of people in these relationships are making us really examine our beliefs about love, commitment, and family.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder.
Okay.
Given how much marriage and family structures have already changed throughout history, what basic principles should be at the heart of legal recognition for adult relationships moving forward?
It's a big question.
It is. And as we try to balance individual freedom with potential impacts on society, what are the most important things we should be considering in this complex and constantly changing world?
That's a really good question for everyone to think about.
It is.
I don't know if I have the answer.
Me neither, but it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was really interesting.
It was.
Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.